morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Good, good, good. Good to see you. Thanks for hanging out with us this Sunday morning. I got a few announcements I want to share with you before we get into our message time. Journey Women, you have an event that is happening this coming Saturday, March 8th, from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Hope you will jump into that. It's sort of the spring refresh, and it's going to be a great time. They got a great speaker who's going to be leading that, so I hope you will do that. On March the 23rd, which is a Sunday, we have our Generosity Feeds event happening at Key Middle School. We will not be in this space. We will be over at Key Middle School. There are two sessions. There's 9 o'clock. There's a noon session. We'd love for you to sign up for either one of those. I will say, since you guys are kind of a little bit later in the day, if you're going to come and join us, then we'd love for you to sign up for that 12 o'clock session because that one tends to not have quite as many people sign up, and we'd love to have a good crowd for that. We package about 20,000 meals that day, and they go back out into our community to local nonprofits and schools, and so it's for a good cause. That's our worship service that day. So I hope you will sign up and join us. You can sign up a group. You can bring your one, family, friends, whatever you do, but we're looking forward to that event coming up. And then Joel is leading a class on baptism in 2 weeks during this service, and so you can sign up for that today too. If you're wondering, how do I do that? You can do that through the Church Center app that hopefully that you have on your phone, or you can do it through the QR code that is there in front of you and sign up in those ways. One other thing, if you're a little later than right at the beginning here this morning, you missed this part. You came in, you saw the sheeting out in the lobby area. We're expanding our lobby space, and so we are probably by next week, we have that open, give us a lot more space, kind of a hangout space, and allow us to do a few more things. So we're excited about having that happen. The last thing I want to bring to your attention, I told you this last week, we started doing this last Sunday. If you go to our app, you hit the More button, you go to Weekend Services. For some reason they make you push this Journey logo. It'll take you to the message that we're on today. It says take notes. You can hit that, and then you can actually take notes and follow along as I chat this morning. And had quite a few of you tell us that it's been really helpful. And so hope you can do that. You can send it to yourself, you can save it, whatever, and then go back and look at it later on, okay? All right, we're in this series called Heart Attack. I thought I'd start out with a few memes, all right? So here we go. I need to borrow my wife's phone. She said her password was our anniversary. Gave the phone back, said I didn't know what happened, right? Some of you guys, maybe you've been there before. All right, ladies, what about this? Marriage is watching your husband drive past 15 good parking spaces before choosing the one that makes absolutely no sense. Some of you ladies, maybe you've been there. Marriage is all about compromise. For example, I didn't want a dog. My wife wanted a dog, so we compromised. Here's our new puppy, Copper. That sounds familiar. And then lastly, all marriages are happy. It's the living together afterward that causes all the trouble. I think sometimes we forget that marriage is just more than a ceremony, right? Like there's what happens after the ceremony, and that's where we learn a lot. We learn a lot about ourselves. We learn a lot about the other person. We learn how to deal with conflict or not deal with conflict, and all of that really plays into our marriage experience. And so if you're married, last week I talked about these postures of marriage. I said for some, we're back to back, and it means that you're an enemy with your spouse. And your home is a battlefield. Your words and actions are weapons that are used towards your spouse. And so for some, maybe you're in a marriage or you know marriages where people are back to back. And then I said there's another posture, and that posture is shoulder to shoulder. A lot of marriages are shoulder to shoulder, really your best friends, buddies, co-workers. And it's not a bad place to be, but something else is a priority. It could be work, it could be kids, maybe it's something else in your life. But your spouse isn't quite the priority for you. And again, I think in our culture today, there's quite a few that fit in that shoulder-to-shoulder relationship. The place we want to be is face-to-face, right? We want to be face-to-face with our spouse. We want to be able to know them and to be known. We talked about intimacy last week, and I told you that one guy who does that thing where he hugs his wife and they hold each other 20 minutes. Anybody do that? Don't tell us. I'm just kidding. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and listen to last week's message. But there's this intimacy piece, right? And so last week, like, hey, why don't you just pray with your spouse every evening and or every day and see where that leads? But marriage is tough, and there's these different postures, and we want to be at this place where we can be face to face. But like I said last week, oftentimes what we struggle with in marriage is communication. There's a lack of communication, and this brings tensions within our marriage. But today, I want to talk about another issue that those of us who are married may face, and it is control, where we're trying to control our spouse. We live in a place full of control freaks, right? Like you're probably a control freak because you live here, because that's what you do for a job. Your job is to oversee this project, oversee this team, oversee this work. And so you control that. And so you control that. And then your kids, let's say you have kids, they play sports. And you're like, well, I'm going to coach their sports team. And my kids are doing this school thing. I'm going to be in charge of that. Or maybe you volunteer in a local organization. You're like, well, you know what? I really want to control that too. And so you lead that. And so we're control freaks here. And it influences us so much that it's not just outside of our home where we see that. We tend to bring that inside our homes too, especially in the area of marriage, especially in the area that we should be intimate with our spouse, and yet we try to control them. This is a picture of my dog. Actually, it's our dog. Actually, it's Kara's dog, and actually that dog came like Copper came in that first little piece there, right? We compromised, and we got a dog. Don't ask me what kind of dog this is. It's a mutt. We got an animal shelter. He's not supposed to be on the couch. I don't know why he's on the couch. And he's not a mean dog. His lip, you ever seen your dog's lip get stuck? And it looks like they're really vicious. He's not actually vicious at all. But I love that picture, so that's why I'm showing it. Anyway, we take Simba for a walk. My favorite leash is the retractable leash, right? So we go out for a walk, and Simba's doing everything Simba's supposed to do. Simba's actually a really good dog. But dude, he's doing everything he's supposed to do. So I let the leash out. I don't know, it's like 20, 25 feet. Simba can smell anything, go anywhere he wants to. Like, hey, here's your freedom. But if Simba doesn't do what I want, what I do is I retract him, right? I pull him back in so I can say, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. This is not what you're supposed to be doing. I need you right here. And so I control my dog with this leash. He meets expectations. Hey, you can have some freedom. You're not meeting my expectations. Hey, I'm going to pull this leash in. Some marriages function as if someone has a dog leash, right? We'll call it a marriage leash. And you use this leash to control your spouse. You do good, right? You clean the house. You met my expectations. You got a raise. You put your dirty socks away. Great. Wonderful. I'm gonna let this leash out. I'm gonna give you some freedom. You don't do good. You don't meet my expectations. You spent money in a way I didn't want you to spend money. You didn't make the bed. You missed trash day. Well, I'm going to pull that leash in because you didn't do what I expected of you. And so sometimes in marriages, it's like someone has a leash on their spouse. And when this is taking place, it means we're trying to control our spouse. There are only two places there should be leashes: on dogs and small kids at Disney World, right? But there should not be leashes in marriages. But maybe you're in a marriage like that, or you've experienced a marriage like that, or you've seen that before. It's where someone's trying to control the other person, and this is not healthy when it comes to a marriage relationship. So what do we do? How do we get beyond that? How do we move from that? Well, I'm going to be in a passage today. It comes out of Ephesians chapter 5, and I'm going to spend all my time there today. And it begins in verse 21. It says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Let me give a little bit of context about this particular passage here. This guy named Paul, he's a pastor, he's a church planter. He plants churches all throughout the Middle East and parts of Asia. And so he'd go to these places, he'd start these churches. Well, sometimes he would write a letter back to them. Sometimes that letter would be specific to a church and sort of a congregation. But other times he would write what were known as circular letters. He'd write a letter, they'd send it to this church. That church would read it out loud. They would copy the original, and then they would send the original to another church close by. And so they would just kind of pass this letter around. This letter in Ephesians is that kind of letter. Again, it's known as a circular letter. And I think Paul would do this because he's like, I got a lot of stuff I want to get out and teachings I want you to learn from. And so he would send a letter like this. Ephesians is one of those letters because he wants people to know exactly what he's trying to get across to them. Right before verse 21 here, Paul is talking about how important it is to live in God's Spirit and to let God's Spirit lead you. And And he says, like, if God's Spirit's not in you, and I'm going to paraphrase here, basically stop being an idiot, okay? Stop thinking about yourself. Stop focusing on yourself. Stop making dumb decisions. That's basically what he says right before verse 21. He's really talking about outward attitudes and behaviors. Like, if you're going to be a follower of Christ, this is what it looks like for you to live this life outside of basically your home, right? But after verse 21, he actually brings it inside the home, and he talks about marriage. Yet in the midst of this, he says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Well, how do we submit? Or why do we submit? Well, we submit because we're focused on following Jesus. And so he's saying, hey, in any relationship you have, always have the mind of Christ. Always be reminded that Jesus is a part of this relationship. Whether it's outside of your home or inside of your home, Jesus is a part of that relationship. But now after verse 21, he starts talking about marriage. What does he say? Verse 22. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For a husband is the head of his wife as Christ is the head of the church. He is the Savior of his body, the church. As the church submits to Christ, so you wives should submit to your husbands in everything. I want you to look up there. I bet I got to the second word and then you kind of spaced out, didn't you? Like we hear wives submit and that's it. You couldn't tell me anything else that comes after that because those first two words are so stuck in our minds. And we hear that and our mind is, well, that means Paul is saying, hey, wives, your husband, he controls you. He holds the leash in your life. And so we kind of get stuck right there on those first two words. Now, I want to take a medical moment in a series called Heart Attack, all right? Listen to me. I just want you to take a deep breath, okay? Breathe. Let it out, okay? Let your pulse rate come down, your blood pressure. Put away the email you're trying to send me. And let's just take a moment because I know in the church world how this has kind of been taught. And I don't necessarily think what we have maybe learned in some of our churches, that what Paul is trying to say here is that control piece. Now, that's where our minds go to, but I think Paul is trying to teach us something much deeper here, okay? So just kind of think about that, but I want to actually talk for a moment about the context of when Paul writes this letter. Sometimes we forget about the context, right? We read these and we think to ourselves, well, how does this fit in the context of where I am right now? Well, we got to forget about that sometimes, and we need to go back and say, okay, how does this fit in the context of what Paul is writing in, all right? So this teaching from Paul in those days would have been radical, it would have been revolutionary, and it would have been countercultural, okay? How so? Listen to this. In the Jewish world, at that time, men had a very low view of women. In fact, men would get up in the morning and they would say their prayers to God and they would say, hey, God, thank you for not making me a Gentile. Thank you for not making me a slave. And thank you for not making me a woman. Now, in that culture, women were things. They were possessions. And in fact, divorce was rampant within the Jewish community. You didn't have to have a reason. A guy could come up to his wife and he could say, hey, here's my bill of divorce. I'm done. I'm moving on. I'm tired of this. I want to move on. You move on. That's it. And so you've got sort of this marital tension that's there. Here's the part I love, though. The ladies were getting sick of it. And so they were getting to the point of like, hey, I'm not going to get married then. If you're going to act that way, we're people, we're humans, treat us like that, or we're not going to get married. So there's this tension, right? There's this marital tension that you find in the Jewish world. Thankfully, you had the Greeks who had it all figured out. In the Greek world, for wealthy families, wives lived in apartments. And there could not be any visitors to this apartment except for the husband. Here's the way one historian put it. Wives were to stay there so they might see as little as possible, hear as little as possible, and ask as little as possible. These are the Greeks. They're supposed to have this right, aren't they? In the Greek world, the expectations were the wife took care of the home and the wife took care of the legitimate kids, which should tell you a lot about that culture too. And as for the husbands, they could find pleasure wherever they wanted it. Okay, so here's Paul. He's writing this in the context of the Jewish marital world. He's writing in the context of this Greek marital world. How about the Romans? Romans got it figured out. They really know what they were doing. Well, in the Roman Republic, Actually, for the first 500 years, no recorded divorces. In 234 BC, you have the first recorded divorce, and we actually have a name. It was by Spurius Carvilius Ruga. And after this happened, divorce began to become rampant within the Roman culture too. And guess what? You could divorce for any reason. Now, in those days, people would kind of talk about who they were and their age based on the emperors that were ruling. But divorce became so rampant that they began to use whoever it was they were married to or how many times they had been married to describe where they were in their family. The biblical scholar Jerome talks about a woman who was married to her 23rd husband, and she was this guy's 21st wife. Here are these cultures that we look back on, and some of us today are like, man, it would probably have been so much easier to live back in those days because it's really hard now. I don't know, but I look at these three cultures and think, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I'm really glad things have changed for us. But marriage was a mess. And so it's in this context that Paul writes this letter, right? He says, marriage is this incredible relationship. And in this incredible relationship, guess what? It should not look like the culture around it. And so he connects marriage to Jesus, and in that he also connects it to the church. But we're probably still stuck on those first two words, right? Wives, submit. I think it's because of our definition of submit. Our definition of submit is giving in to someone or something more powerful than you. That's not what Paul is saying. Paul's not using that word submit here because he's saying, hey, it's about control, it's about dominion, it's about power, it's about conduct, it's about bowing down to someone, it's about giving in or cowering. This is not the context that he is writing about here. Paul's talking about placing the needs and desires of someone else over your own. For Paul, submission is about responsibility towards the other person. And by the way, with Jesus at the center of that relationship. Think about how he talks about this here. He says, hey, wives, you have a responsibility in your marriage. And how does he say it? To submit to your husband as the church submits to Jesus. He's not saying, wives, be passive. He's not saying, wives, be uninvolved. Hey, wives, be controlled. Wives, speak only when you're spoken to. It's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about this word submit. And in it, what he means is really the theme of this series. This word submission or submit for Paul is all about love. And you look at that passage, and you're like, well, hold up, Chad. There's not the word love in there anywhere. I just see this word submit. What are you talking about? We actually need to go to the second part of this passage to really understand that. Verse 25. For husbands, this means love your wives, just as Christ loved the church. He gave up his life for her to make her holy and clean, washed by the cleansing of God's word. He did this to present her to himself as a glorious church without a spot or wrinkle or any other blemish. Instead, she will be holy and without fault. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as they love their own bodies. For a man who loves his wife actually shows love for himself. No one hates his own body, but feeds and cares for it, just as Christ cares for the church. And we are members of his body. Now, I want you to look up there. How much more does he give to the dudes than the ladies? A lot, right? Because guys are hard-headed, and we need a little bit more information there. But he describes this in such a way, he's like, hey, this is what this looks like. And I'm just going to be honest with you. I'm going to give the dudes a hard time here for the next few moments, all right? So I love you guys, but sometimes we need a little bit extra. But do you notice, too, how he talks about this relationship? He's like, yeah, the wives, you have a responsibility, but so do the guys. He says, guys, love your wife like what? Like Christ loved the church. What does this have to do with marriage? William Barclay, in his commentary on this passage, he says, this is for Paul, Christian marriage is the most precious relationship in life, whose only parallel is the relationship between Christ and the church. The basis of the passage is not control, it is love. That's what we've been talking about in this whole series, right? We've been talking about love. Now, we've also said each week, like, hey, when we talk about love, we'll say, I love my dog, I love my wife, I love spring training for baseball. And then by however it's put into the sentence, we understand the context of love. In the ancient Greek, there were actually 4 words for love. There was the word eros, which was sensual love. We get our word erotic from this. There's philia, which is friendship. There's this terrible city just a little bit north of here that won a Super Bowl, a couple of weeks ago called Philadelphia. It gets its name from that. It's supposed to be brotherly love. I don't know if you've been there before. There's not a whole lot of brotherly love in Philadelphia. But that's another word for love. Storge was another word. It means caring or nurturing. It means love for a family or love for a dog. By the way, look, there's no love word for cats, so I just want to leave that there for all the cat lovers. And then there's the 4th word, agape, right? We see that last word, that top word there, agape, which means this unconditional, sacrificial love. Okay, here's the deal. If you and I are writing about marriage and a love within that marriage, we're probably not using that very top word. We're going to use those last 3 because that makes sense to us. Paul, again, we've said this in the series, uses this word agape over and over and over again. It is not a romantic word at all. But he's making a point. He's saying, this is what love looks like. When you love someone unconditionally, when you love someone sacrificially, that is the kind of love that we are called to have within our relationships. When you talk about agape, it's not based on merit. It's not based on looks. It's not based on the size of your paycheck or the gifts you give or whether you clean the house or took the car in for an inspection. It is way, way more than that. Agape is this bond that cannot be broken. That no matter how hard you try to break it, you cannot break this bond. And it is us fully giving ourselves over to the other person while not looking for anything in return. That's sacrificial love. That's agape. So if we go back to what Paul writes here and look at Ephesians chapter 5:25, we throw agape in here. Here's how it reads. For husbands, this means agape your wives, just as Christ agape the church. Right? That's the kind of love that we're supposed to have. And how did Jesus agape the church? Well, look at the rest of verse 25. He gave up his life for her. Now that her, we see there at the end, it's not somebody Jesus is married to. It's not a girlfriend he has. It's not a close friend of his. That her is not that. That her actually is the church. In the New Testament, over and over again, we hear the church described as the bride of Christ. And so Paul is telling husbands here, love your spouse like Jesus agape the church, like Jesus loved his bride, the church. Listen to these words from 4th century church father John Chrysostom. He describes the same passage this way. He says, have care thyself for her as Christ for the church. And if it be needful that thou shouldest give thy life for her, or be cut to pieces 1,000 times, or endure anything whatever, refuse it not. He brought the church to his feet by his great care, not by threats, nor fear, or any such thing. So do thou conduct thyself towards thy wife. Paul doesn't say make excuses for why you don't want to love your spouse, right? She's not this. She doesn't do that. Have you seen her win? That's not what Paul's talking about. Paul doesn't say, hey, audit your marriage and then figure out which level of love you want to express to your spouse. That's not what he says here in this passage. He's talking about, hey, look at the way Jesus loved the church, his bride, and what he was willing to do for the church. What does he do? He gives his life fully, sacrificially, this unconditional love to the church. Like that's the kind of love we should have. So now husbands, show that same love to your wife. Wives, show that same love to your husband. Are you willing to lay down your life for them? About 8 years ago, our family took a beach trip down to Surfside Beach, South Carolina. We usually do the Outer Banks, but my parents had taken us there a couple years before that, and so we really loved it and went back down. And we were there with our family and then another group of family members and having a great time. One day we're out in the ocean, we're swimming, we're boogie boarding, we're doing all the fun stuff you do in the water. Well, it's really kind of, like I said, the second time we had been there. We're looking a little bit north of us, and we see that all the people that were out in the water have begun to move towards the shore. Again, we don't know what they're doing. Outer Banks, this never happens, okay? People are moving in the shore, and then as we're watching, we notice that there are lifeguards, and they're like motioning for people to come in. Like, what is going on? Look out into the water, and there's this big old dark spot, and it's rippling on top of the water, and fish are jumping up and down. Oh, it's a school of fish, who, by the way, have brought some of their sharp-toothed friends with them, right? I've seen Jaws multiple times. I know what's getting ready to happen. Now it totally makes sense to me of why they're trying to get people out of the water. And this school of fish with their friends are coming toward us. And so I'm there with family, and I'm like, we better go. And I take off to the shore. Meanwhile, still back in the water are my wife, who I love tremendously, our 3 small kids, the family that we went with, who I did nothing to try to save anybody's life, right? To get him in. I'm like, I need to take care of Chad. I'm going in as fast as I can. I was talking to Kara about that yesterday, and she laughed her head off because she's like, yep, that's exactly how that happened. I kind of got to ask myself, like, hey, am I going to lay down my life for my wife? I have limits, I guess. Sharks and tornadoes, and that's another story for another time, okay? Now, is Paul talking about physically giving up your life for your spouse? Maybe. Like, that could be a part of it. But he's talking about something much deeper than that. He's talking about sacrificially loving your spouse, to love them like Jesus loved the church, being willing to give all of you to your spouse. This isn't about control. And so when Paul uses that word submit here, he's really saying, hey, control yourself, and you do that by giving the sacrificial love to your spouse. Husbands, submit to your wife with sacrificial love. Wives, submit to your husband with sacrificial love. That's a healthy marriage. It's about submitting because of love. Same kind of love Jesus had for the church and still has for the church today. But how can we do this? I'm going to give you just some really practical steps you can take. And by the way, there may be more, and you may do some other things, and that's totally fine. These are some that might be helpful. The first one I would say is give your spouse some space. And maybe some of you are like, yes, exactly. That's what I've been asking for. I've been asking for some space. It's probably not quite the space that you're thinking it is. Giving space means letting go of the leash, right? Letting go of control. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden you got freedom and you can do whatever you want within the marriage. You are a team. Paul talks about this in this passage, like, hey, the two will become one. You're a team. You're together in this, but be willing to give up the control that maybe you have within your marriage. What does giving this space mean? It means trusting your spouse to make decisions that are theirs. Again, it doesn't mean free reign, but it means you're in this together and giving space as needed. How do we do this? One idea is that maybe every week or every couple of weeks you just get together and you have a little couple meeting, right? And you talk about your calendar, you talk about your schedule, you talk about things that are happening, you talk about events that are going on. And so you make sure you've got all this on your calendar and you know what's happening. Like I said last week, sometimes if you're married and you got kids can take the priority and you forget about your spouse. And maybe you're setting up like, hey, this night we're going to lock their kids in the rooms. We don't care. And we're just going to spend a little time together. We're going to eat together and quiet. That might be, there you go. That might be yelling, but hey, that's okay. Well, as long as we're good, right? Put a camera in there and watch and make sure they're okay. Maybe that's it, but it could be more. I think it's more than that too. It's being able to say, hey, I need some time for me. That doesn't mean every day, okay? But hey, in a couple of weeks, I want to go do this with the boys. And in a couple of weeks, I want to go do this with the girls. And hey, I want to go work out by myself, or I want to just be quiet and read a book, or I want to go play golf, whatever it may be. But make this a part of this conversation that you have with your spouse. And give them space because you trust them, right? And you trust them because you believe in the power of this love that you have for them and them for you. You give them space because of your love for Jesus, okay? So give them space. Second thing I would say is deal with your past. Oftentimes, I think the reason that marriages really struggle is because of past relationships. And sometimes that past is actually connected to the house you grew up in, okay? You watched your mom and dad, and maybe in that relationship, one of them was in control of the other one. And so in your mind, you're thinking, well, that's what marriage is all about, right? This is my role, and my job is to control this other person. And so that's what you have learned. That is your past, and you bring that into your marriage relationship. Or kind of vice versa there, you watched it, and your other parent that's the same person as you, like they sat there and like, hey, I'm supposed to be controlled by them. This is how marriage works. This is how marriage functions. It's not the way our relationships are supposed to be. Paul even shares here in Ephesians 5, he goes back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. He quotes this. He says, a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. N.T. Wright is a pastor and British theologian. He writes this about Paul's use of Genesis 2:24 here. He said, that is full of psychological insight. Often what pulls a marriage off course is the failure of one or other partner to distance themselves emotionally from their parents and devote themselves totally to their spouse. Sometimes what we grew up with becomes the same kind of marriage that we have right now, and that's not necessarily always healthy. So we got to deal with that past. For others, it may be dating relationships from our past, or maybe a past marriage, and the same thing was taking place. We were controlled, and maybe you were in the dating world, and you were controlled by someone. You think that's how you experience love and show love, and so you go to another relationship, and you're experiencing the same thing. You're being controlled. Really, it's this fear that is there, and we don't know how to deal with fear many times, and so it's like, well, if I got this fear of not being loved, then I'll take whatever I can get, and so again, there's that tension that's there, and we've got to deal with that past, or maybe we were the one that were controlling other people in that dating world or in that marriage. And so that past just keeps following us everywhere we go. How do we deal with that? I'm just going to be honest. It's getting professional help. Like you need a counselor to help you walk through that because you can't get beyond your past on your own, especially, honestly, like if this has been part of your DNA for so many years. You have to have someone help you break through that and break that cycle. That's why we talk a lot about counseling here at The Journey. We have this incredible relationship with Safe Harbor. We'd love to get you connected if this is something you want to work through. Again, the email address is there. You can hit us up, or you can go to our app or the QR code, and there's a form there. You can fill that out, and that comes directly to us, and we'll get you connected. We actually have a few more local counselors who we work with, and we can connect you with them too, okay? But as I talk about that, I want to kind of push a little bit further. I didn't talk about this last week, but I had it in my notes, and I don't know why, but I'll say it today. Ladies, if you're in an abusive marriage, physically, sexually, emotionally, spiritually, I don't believe at all that that's the kind of marriage God intends for you to be in. And we want to help you through that, okay? Let me say this too. Gentlemen, if you are in a marriage that is abusive, physically, emotionally, sexually, mentally, spiritually, I don't believe that that is a marriage that God has intended for you either. And if you want to debate me on that, we can do that, not today, some other time, but we can debate that as much as you want, but don't believe we are called to be in marriages like that. And as a church, we want to help you take next steps to find the healing that you need. And so feel free to connect with us. Let us know. We would really do want to help you walk through that. And a big part of that would be working with a counselor to help you move beyond this past that you've experienced, okay? So deal with your past. It has a huge, huge bearing on marriages. And then last thing I would say here is the 5 Love Languages book. It's by Dr. Gary Chapman. I get no residuals or anything, royalties from this, but this book has been very helpful in my marriage with Kara. Our first year of marriage was rough, and sometimes people go downstairs like, hey, Kara, Chad said this. What was that like? So don't go down and say, hey, Chad, was this a rough marriage your first year? She already knows, right? Because we talked about it yesterday. And it was a hard time for us. And somebody said, hey, why don't you guys read the 5 Love Languages book? We did, and it really transformed our marriage. We were looking for the book that we have yesterday. I think we gave it to one of our kids. And Kara's like, well, I don't remember doing it the first year. And I was like, well, I do. She's like, but I remember us doing it like 15 years ago because we thought we needed to just kind of go through it again. So we did. And we were like, well, we probably need to do it again. Don't just do it one time. Just kind of see who you are. But get the book. If you are on our sermon notes, there's a link there. You can actually link that or connect on that to Amazon, and you can purchase that. He does books for teens, for kids. He does it for military spouses. But it's just taking the time to read it and take the test. And I bring this up because we're talking about sacrificial, unconditional love. If we don't know what kind of love our spouse needs, we're just going to do what we know. And so if my love language is gifts and hers is, words of affirmation, and I just keep giving her gifts all the time, she's like, why are you spending all this money, right? I mean, why are you keep giving me gifts? I'm like, well, that's your love language, isn't it? Well, no, that's your love language. That's mine. And if she's just giving words of affirmation and I need gifts, then I'm just like, why do you keep encouraging me? Thanks, but I want some stuff. Give me some stuff, right? So, that's not our love languages, by the way. But anyway, that was just a total example, so don't go downstairs and say that. Learn your spouse's love language. And then, like we're talking about, then express it sacrificially and unconditionally to them, okay? If there's this gifts, man, doesn't mean you're spending thousands of dollars on them, but you're doing things like, hey, I love you, and I'm going to show you that I love you, and I understand you, and I'm connected with you, and I'm trying to know you in this intimate way that God has created us to be, and you're sharing that with each other. It's an amazing first step. And I will tell you that just taking the time to do that was marriage-changing, life-changing for Kara and I, and like I said, we continue to learn through that. So something simple and easy, and again, a great starting point to do just that. Marriage doesn't get better because you lay down the law in your marriage. Marriage doesn't get better because you force someone to meet your expectations, okay? Marriages get better, and they heal because we learn something about ourselves. Like we take the time to deal with our past and what we've experienced. Marriages get better, and they heal because we understand our spouse better. We understand how we should fully love them. And so for some of us, we got to let the leash go. We got to let go of control, let go of our fears, and begin to live out the sacrificial, unconditional, I would die for you love. Like Paul talks about here in Ephesians chapter 5. And I say this because I believe that's what God intended. That we would live those kinds of lives. And we would put Jesus first. And because Jesus is first, we know that we can love our spouse in that way. We can love them sacrificially.